What does the grid mean for the climate crisis?
I mean, it's everything. When it comes to all of the kind of major studies that have been done on this in Canada and around the world, when we think about how we address climate change, how we get off of fossil fuels and toward cleaner sources of energy, the first thing on that list is to electrify. And that means to stop burning fossil fuels and instead of burning fossil fuels to meet our energy needs, we instead use clean electricity to meet those same needs.
Welcome to Class and Climate, a podcast where the end of the world meets the end of the month. My name is M. Thompson. Canada is an extremely horizontal country, not in terms of its social structure or its work ethic, but as a landmass. Canada's east-west distance is longer than that of any other nation state except Russia. But Canada's electricity grid is barely integrated from province to province. That is, barely integrated from east to west. The electrical systems of Canada's most populous provinces, those who run along the south, from BC to the Maritimes, are integrated for the most part vertically. That is, they run north to south to the United States. But they are hardly connected to each other at all. Things get even weirder in the northern territories, which aren't even connected to the North American grid, but have to run on their own system. It's left the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and none of it to fend for themselves, their own diesel-powered plants, and the highest electricity costs in the country. As the C.D. Howe Institute put it last December, there really is no Canadian power grid. This is a big inefficiency for industry and for the rest of us. For years, governments have wrestled with how to build out the grid, and that raises big questions about how the infrastructure should be built, who should build it, how it should be run, and for whom. Draws on the politics of land, labor, and capital. Today, our guest Stephen Thomas from the David Suzuki Foundation will tell us about a new coalition of labor and environmental groups pressing for a socially owned grid build-out. He'll also tell us how it can empower communities and workers across the country.
Stephen, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
We're going to talk today about questions of grid building and the like, but I want to just kind of set the context. When Mark Carney was running in the last election, we were kind of promised, or we were told that this was a transformative crisis. And basically, I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but that the government would respond with transformative interventions and policies. And one of the big planks was the major projects initiatives out of the major projects office. If you were to draw a balance sheet, as we're roughly a year into the Carney period, I was going to say Carney's reign. That sounds a bit over the top. But what would that balance sheet look like?
It's funny that you also use the word transformative because I know the Prime Minister used that word to kind of like insult Donald Trump without him quite catching on. But it has been one heck of a year, that's for sure. And I think this government under this Prime Minister have made a lot of choices that certainly change Canada in radical ways. There's no question that in the last 12 or 14 months, this country has really, really changed. I'd say the major projects office and Bill C5 and everything along with that is a big part of that change, and not all of it is for the better. Bill C5 in particular gives this government far too much power to more or less disregard any law it chooses. And so the David Suzuki Foundation, where I work, and many other environment and civil society organizations have certainly opposed that part of this agenda. And an extension of this agenda is building everything. And I think an all of the above approach, at least when it comes to the energy transition, is very outdated and is not at all taking into account the economic realities of the world we're living in today. So we also hear the Prime Minister talking a lot about being an economic and social realist, someone who reacts to and interacts with the realities of the world as it is, not as we want it to be. And I think that's There's nowhere where that's more true when it comes to the energy transition and climate. Whether or not oil interests here in Canada or certain politicians here in Canada want it to be true, the world is changing. We are moving away from oil, gas, and coal, and investing in oil, gas, and coal with these major projects or in any other way is a mistake. We're going to lead ourselves down a road to stranded assets and wasted money and wasted time, and we do not have time or money to waste right now.
Right. And I think one other place you've seen the shift, particularly in the last budget, was a bit of a rhetorical shift that, after a couple years of the government talking about climate action, we're having the phrase, climate competitiveness instead. And within the budget, you find several references to not phasing out fossil fuels, not reducing Canada's dependence on fossil fuels, but actually making Canada more of a fossil fuel superpower. Is that part of this trend, would you say?
I think it is, and I think that's the part that we think is a mistake and one that we can't really afford to make. It's clearly the stated policy intent of the federal government to double down on at least oil and gas, which is just a shame to say the very least. They're moving away from the whole suite of climate regulations and climate policies that were built up over the last 10 years. And they keep telling us, they keep telling Canadians that something's coming, to trust them, to trust that the industrial carbon price or something else is coming soon to address Canada's climate obligations. But we haven't seen anything yet. The climate competitiveness strategy was extremely light on detail. We're waiting on some other nature and clean electricity strategies, at least at the time that we're recording this. Um, but we have a lot more detail to see. So this government has a lot of room for improvement when it comes to changing course when it comes to oil and gas. At the provincial level, it's even worse when we think about the province of Alberta and Premier Daniel Smith in particular, who's now stated that they want to double the production of oil and gas by the year 2035 in Alberta, which would absolutely blow the top up of any kind of climate plan that Canada may have. So we've got a problem in our approach to climate in Canada, but I think we've got a long list of solutions too, and that's what's so exciting, but also so frustrating for those of us working on this now, is that there are just a long and exciting list of projects and pathways, if you will, that we can go down that bring real benefits to Canadians, that save people money on their energy bills, and that use technologies that are ready for prime time, that are ready to go right now. So I'm excited to talk about that piece too as the kind of opportunity ahead.
And one thing I think that's interesting here is it's not like the projects that have been announced aren't big and expensive. They're kind of just going in the wrong direction into the wrong things. I think it's announced right, like the carbon capture project, which we'll talk about in a moment, is not cheap and it's not small. The idea of building these pipelines, expanding LNG is a major undertaking. It's just not an undertaking that is going to, in the long run, be sustainable. I think it seems quite obvious to me. On the electricity side, which you mentioned, what do the government's priorities look like there?
When it comes to electricity, it's actually at this point, at the point of recording, we're recording this on March 3rd. We don't know what the federal government's priorities are on electricity. They've got some rhetoric out there, some things that have been included in last year's budget and the platform last election. But they've been signaling that they're going to release what's called a national electricity strategy, which will tell us a lot more about this government's priorities. But right now, we're doing some guesswork, and we're just trying to pick up the pieces from all the separate announcements that they've been making. I'd say it's very fair to say that this government does see the value in upgrading Canada's grid. And I'd love to talk more about that too, because we also see that value. I think it's fair to say this government sees the value in building out the electricity system in Canada. We've heard the Prime Minister say that it's their goal to double the size of the electricity system in Canada. But what we double it with, be that more fossil fuels on the grid, renewables, nuclear, hydro, or whatever it may be is kind of yet to be seen from this government and the details of their strategy. But I'm really excited to talk about those two pieces when it comes to upgrading Canada's grid and building out the grid with renewables too.
What does the grid mean for the climate crisis?
I mean, it's everything. When it comes to all of the kind of major studies that have been done on this in Canada and around the world, when we think about how we address climate change, how we get off of fossil fuels and toward cleaner sources of energy, the first thing on that list is to electrify. And that means to stop burning fossil fuels and instead of burning fossil fuels to meet our energy needs, we instead use clean electricity to meet those same needs. So some really common examples are things like our cars and our vehicles. Instead of burning gasoline and diesel in our vehicles, we switch to electric vehicles or electric public transport where we can get the energy for those things from renewables. Similarly, in our homes, to keep ourselves warm in the winter, we need to move away from burning fossil fuels like home heating oil and natural gas, and instead move to things like high efficiency electric heat pumps, which save people money on their energy bills. And the energy that they do use comes again potentially from wind and solar and clean sources. There are lots of examples like that all up and down our energy system in Canada. And that's what we mean when we say electrification. It's moving to those things. So it's the the attention that we need to pay to upgrading our grid to make sure it's ready to move all those energy sources over to electricity and to build out the sources of generating that electricity when it comes to wind and solar and things like it. Those are really, really important right now, both when it comes to Canada's overall economy and certainly with our work to address climate change. But I'm keen to talk about kind of all of the societal and economic benefits of what that means for Canada specifically too.
With the current grid, what would you say are the main problems we have?
I'd say we have a couple problems with where we stand now on the electricity grids in Canada. You'll have heard from this government and from, I'm sure, many others that for the most part, Canada's electricity generation is pretty clean, at least compared to many other countries. More than 80% of the electricity we produce today comes from non-emitting sources. That doesn't mean they don't have impacts, but it means that they have very few or no carbon emissions. So things like hydroelectricity in Quebec, Manitoba, British Columbia, Newfoundland and Labrador, a little bit in Ontario, nuclear electricity from Ontario and New Brunswick. It's more than 80% of our electricity system right there. But uh, it's very piecemeal and it's very disconnected, the grid itself. And that leads to some pockets where it's very dirty. So in Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and kind of a little bit throughout the country, you have these pockets where it's very fossil fuel intensive electricity. That's what we need to clean up is the fossil fuels on the grid where they are today. And as we move forward, as we double the amount of electricity that we're going to be using in Canada, we need to make sure that that new electricity is also clean. And that's a really active fight right now because natural gas companies are trying to build out an enormous amount of fossil fuels on the grid. So that I think how dirty our grid is in Canada, how dirty it might be, is one problem. The other that I think these upgrades can solve is the fact that our grids are very disconnected right now in Canada. We effectively have 10 provincial grids and then some disconnected electricity infrastructure in the north and in northern and remote communities. So those 10 provincial grids are run independently. It's completely the jurisdiction of provinces when it comes to how we operate our electricity systems. So that's meant that each province is pretty on its own when it comes to their electricity system and how they use it and how they balance it. There are connections between some neighboring provinces, but they're not nearly enough to do the work of actually sharing electricity across provincial borders in a big way, or doing this work of upgrading the grid that we talk about too. So that's really important for us is what we call interprovincial transmission links, new electricity lines between provinces. Because once we connect two provinces, We can greatly increase the amount of electricity sharing that we do. We open up access to cheaper electricity from one province being used in the other, or when it's sunny in one province, they can use the solar electricity and send it across that line. If it's windy in the other province, vice versa. And it just opens up much more collaboration. And at the end of the day, what that means is cheaper electricity for people in each of those provinces that are sharing the electricity.
And when you say in Alberta, for instance, it's more fossil fuel intensive, you mean primarily LNG, right? Is that also coal or?
The fossil fuels on the grid vary by province. It's a lot of coal in places like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, and a little bit New Brunswick. We have natural gas. The vast majority, I think, of the problem, I'll say, right now and in the future is with expanding natural gas generation. So there's tons of gas in those four provinces, but elsewhere in Canada too. And less so when it comes to burning oil. Burning diesel or oil is typically in remote communities. So that's the primary fossil fuel and the primary thing folks are trying to get off of when it comes to remote and indigenous communities and electricity systems in the north in Canada. I'd say that's a different kind of set of problems that is really community specific as we're getting off of diesel on those remote grids. But that's kind of the picture of where fossil fuels land on the grid in Canada.
In terms of when we talk about making sure the grid's clean and connecting it east to west instead of just north to south, because actually quite a lot of the grids, as far as I understand, are more connected to the United States than they are to each other. Uh,
Exactly.
and I guess if we could just talk about that, why is that inefficient? I think most listeners can probably use their imagination, but just to tease it out.
Well, I think it's perfectly efficient, and I think there's lots of reasons over the last 80 or 100 years why provinces have built electricity connections to the United States, and it's mostly for export. And that's, I think, another thing that we and others are trying to change in how we think about the electricity system and how we think about electricity connections in Canada is right now, the way it's been done for so long is that you build a giant generating station, maybe a large hydro dam or a large coal plant, and then you sign a contract with your neighbor to sell that electricity over a big line. So that's the case in particularly British Columbia, Manitoba, Quebec, Ontario, but there are kind of lines all over where there's a big source of electricity generation in a province, and they sell that electricity to the state that's neighboring them to the south. That makes a lot of sense in a lot of cases because electricity is more expensive in some of these places in the United States. But what it exposes us to is the huge volatility of the politics of being next to the United States at this time. I think if I'm stumbling here because we all need to cross our fingers and hope that the folks in the United States don't slide further down the path to fascism as they are now. But if there's ever a world where Donald Trump isn't the president and the United States is in a better place, then I think it still does make sense for us to share electricity with the United States. But right now, it's just absolutely a non-starter. So what we need to focus on is strengthening the electricity grid within Canada. So instead of selling from one place and buying in another, what we need to do a lot more of is electricity sharing, a lot more collaboration between those lines. That's where the most of the benefits, I think, are for Canadians. And that's the main thing that leads to electricity bills going down for Canadians too.
And so, by deduction, is it the case that having the grid not run east-west, but instead run north-south, where it then gets kind of transferred back even, is that a thing that's driving up relative costs for electricity?
It is a huge risk to do that right now. I actually don't know that that's a big driver today when we
Yeah.
talk about electricity bills rising, but that's a huge risk right now.
Mhm.
Who knows what's happening with tariffs and if that's going to be a place where they're applied to, or just the general trade disruption with the United States. It's just a huge exposure for us.
And what's the mechanism by which having the grid run east and west would potentially bring down electricity costs? Like, how would that work out?
It's mostly having access to cheaper electricity from your neighbor. So if you're in Alberta, for instance, and you want to trade electricity with Saskatchewan, your options are very limited. There's very few connections these days. But let's say the weather is good in Saskatchewan, it's very sunny, and they have an excess of very cheap solar power. Right now, there's really nowhere for that to go. But if you're Alberta and it's a cold afternoon, it's not quite as sunny in Alberta that day, and you really need electricity, your only options are to burn a lot of fossil fuels, burn a lot of natural gas to make that happen, which is much more expensive than what that solar electricity would be. But if you can kind of wave a magic wand and all of a sudden there is a electricity line that gives you access to that cheap solar power in Saskatchewan, then all of a sudden the electricity price goes down for you in that scenario. And there are like dozens of kind of little examples of that that can happen across provincial borders, that overall bring down the cost of energy because it gives each electricity system more choice for where it can draw from kind of cheap, abundant, renewable electricity. And I'd say that also, not only these connections and this collaboration, but a focus on renewables is the key thing that brings these costs down too. Wind and solar are the cheapest forms of electricity in history. They're cheaper than everything else. They're cheaper than coal, they're cheaper than gas, they're cheaper than oil, they're cheaper than any other thing that we can put on the grid. So, in this next phase of building out electricity in Canada, we're going to build a lot of wind and solar, and we should. And making sure that that cheap, abundant, renewable electricity is able to be accessed by more people across provincial boundaries is going to be really important too. But that's the result. Overall, it's going to bring down the cost of energy for people in Canada. Um, I also want to touch on energy efficiency in this conversation. Something I talk about a lot is building out the grid and the work of building big projects and creating tens of thousands of good paying jobs in Canada when it comes to building new things, building new generation. But it also makes so much sense to use the energy we have smarter, more efficiently. And there's an enormous amount of potential there too, not only for saving people money on their energy bills, but for creating more jobs there too. When it comes to it's better insulating our homes, when it comes to changing out our appliances for something that's more efficient, when it comes to, as we said earlier, moving away from something like fossil fuel burning in our homes and moving toward an electric high efficiency heat pump. All of these things save us money on our energy bills, but they also put people to work where we live. Instead of going to work in a faraway place, um, you can work in your own community, installing these heat pumps or installing this insulation or installing these energy efficient appliances. And that's exciting for us too, as kind of a local economic benefit and more broadly, just a great a place to work is improving your housing stock in your own community where you live. It's funny to me that we talk so much in Canada about the jobs in the oil and gas sector, when there is more than double the amount of people working in the energy efficiency sector in Canada than the oil and gas sector. More than 466,000 people are working in the energy efficiency sector right now in Canada, where less than 200,000 are working directly in the oil and gas sector. So these things are already happening. We don't need to wait for some kind of magic solution or the magic wand I talked about earlier. All these technologies are kind of ready to go. It's just a matter of policy priority here in Canada to make them happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting when we think about green jobs. We often just think about the people making solar panels, and even sometimes it can be there can be a kind of neoliberal impulse, right? Like the idea is like we'll just give money to privatize solar panel companies ad infinitum. But here we're talking about building out permanent public infrastructure to lower the cost of energy. And as far as I understand, there would also be, potentially economies of scale also bound up in there, right?
Completely. Economies of scale and opportunity for investment in manufacturing here too.
Hmm.
I agree with you that the most exciting opportunity here is public ownership of grid infrastructure.
Mm.
I think community ownership of the renewable electricity generation should be a priority here too. And we need to build on the existing leadership of Indigenous communities when it comes to building and owning and benefiting from renewable electricity in Canada. Indigenous communities, if you kind of put all those Indigenous owned projects together, they're the second largest asset owner of renewables in Canada. They don't need to take direction from the Canadian government or from settler communities. they're already leading, and the rest of us have a lot to learn from the leadership of Indigenous communities on renewables. The folks at Indigenous Clean Energy, in particular, are doing fantastic capacity building work, but many other Indigenous-led organizations and nations themselves are just doing really great work, making sure that procurements and projects focus on that as an opportunity for Indigenous ownership and the benefits flowing to Indigenous communities. So I'd say all that is a big opportunity, and I really agree with you on those ownership pieces. But when you talk about the economies of scale, of course, that means we save money because we're building tens of billions of dollars worth of new things. But what that also allows us to do in Canada, finally and for the first time, is have manufacturing of these things in Canada. Right now, when we're building wind turbines and solar panels and heat pumps and all these things, for the most part, they're manufactured elsewhere, and we're importing them as finished products and then installing them here in Canada. I think that still has benefits, that still saves us money, but we're really missing the opportunity to build these things here at home too. And there are many reasons why it hasn't made sense for large OEMs, large manufacturers of these things to set up shop in Canada. But the main thing is that scale. The history of renewable energy development in Canada is one of boom and bust. You have one provincial government put out a big procurement for renewables, and then the next provincial government cancel all the contracts and rip up wind turbines and so on. So that doesn't make a very attractive place to set up a factory or to set up a manufacturing hub, because you don't know if that's going to be there long term, if the kind of opportunity to sell these things in Canada is going to be there. But I think we finally have that when we talk about doubling the electricity system and most of that coming from wind and solar. That's part of the opportunity here too, is making these things here in Canada, which is really exciting for us. But beyond the wind and solar part, I don't need to tell your listeners that right now with the American tariffs, two sectors that are really hurting are aluminum and steel with the American tariffs and broader threats from the States. And these are two sectors that stand to really benefit from this energy transition if we do it right. When we talk about wind turbines, the towers, of course, are made of steel. There's tons of steel and aluminum components in solar panels and solar projects. But really, I'm thinking of when we build out that grid and we build out new electricity connections between provinces, we're talking about 5, 6, 7,000 kilometers of new electricity lines. And the things that those electricity lines are made of are aluminum and steel. So if we can do the work of incentivizing Canadian content in that steel and in that aluminum, then I think we're just multiplying the benefits when it comes to good work here in Canada and showing up for sectors that are really hard hit right now.
So why isn't this happening? I guess is my question, as far
That's
as
a
you
great
understand.
question. I mean, our hope is that this government picks up this idea as an idea whose time has finally come, and we do this thing and in quick order. We're working very hard with a coalition of more than 20 other groups, labor unions, Indigenous clean energy leaders, and Indigenous-led organizations, with health groups and faith groups, and many others to have these conversations with federal policymakers. We're going to be in Ottawa in April, having dozens of meetings with MPs and policymakers to try and make the case for this upgraded grid, one that's based on renewables, one that respects the rights of workers, and one that shows up for and prioritizes the rights of Indigenous people and Indigenous ownership of these resources too. So, I mean, I hope it happens. I hope we don't have to ask ourselves why it's not happening for that much longer. But I'll say that incumbency is a huge thing in Canada when it comes to projects and when it comes to the energy sector more broadly, and the oil and gas interests. The lobby groups that work on behalf of the oil and gas interests have a ton of incumbency and tens of millions of dollars to throw at these problems. So they being the oil and gas sector and the people who own those companies are very desperate right now, and they're trying everything when it comes to lobbying and advertisements and greenwashing to lock in more investment in the oil and gas sector. I think we'll talk about that a little bit later with CCUS and projects like that. But but when this government is out there looking for big projects, the oil and gas industry has been very busy getting in front of them and trying to pitch big projects. They met with this federal government more than 950 times in 2025. That's more than 3 or 4 times every working day in the calendar year. They've been actively lobbying this federal government. So it's not surprising, I think, for some of us to see that the oil and gas industry continues to enjoy a lot more attention from this government and more broadly across Canada. So I'd say that has a big part of why it hasn't happened. But I'd say this, when maybe focusing in on this grid thing, building out and upgrading Canada's grid, a big reason why it hasn't happened yet is that the federal government hasn't been willing to be involved in the way that I think they should be involved now. When we talk about building a connection between two provinces, um, as we said earlier, the electricity system is fully in the jurisdiction of that province. So in order to build a connection between two provinces, you need the province on one end of the line to be involved, along with the electric utility and a bunch of stakeholders. You need the province on the other end of that line to be involved, along with their utility and a bunch of stakeholders. You, of course, need the Indigenous nations on whose territory these lines are on or they cross. And you need the federal government who holds some jurisdiction in cross-provincial energy too. So it's just a lot of people at the table. And those folks at the table often argue about who should pay for it. So that's the clear line that we've been taking on this, and that's one of the things that we think can really unlock this is the federal government offering up a lot of money when it comes to loans through the Canada Investment Bank, and when it comes to tax credits, and also perhaps ownership, where the federal government owns at least parts of these lines. So I think it's just been complicated, and it's been, not in an emergency frame for a very long time. But I think we're there. I think this is an idea that's, whose time has finally come. And that's what we're kind of excited to push for here over the next year or so.
Right. And in lieu of this kind of grid build out, as far as I understand, the main priorities of the government have been building up mines, natural gas infrastructure, and this thing called carbon capture.
Hmm.
When we look at this focus, I guess why is this focus bad for the planet? And I guess maybe also why is it bad for humans? I wouldn't separate the two, but I think, broadly speaking, for economic development, for social development, and the like.
Yeah, I think that CCUS, and for the listeners, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, the idea to, put a giant filter on the tailpipe of a big project and try and capture those emissions and then somehow sequester them. So CCUS is a mistake, I think, because it doesn't work. It's a money pit, and the oil and gas industry itself doesn't even want to do it. So it's kind of a solution without a problem, or it's a it's a total false solution in my view. And as we said earlier, in this time of dire need, where Canadians are struggling with affordability, and where we really need some solutions on the table right now to show up for communities. CCUS is a waste of time and money, and we have neither of those things to spare right now. It's just such a wasted opportunity. It doesn't work because there's specifically when we talk about the CCUS project called the Pathways Project, where the major oil sands producers in Canada want a giant pipeline of captured carbon, where they capture a bunch of carbon from their projects and then run it down a pipeline and then put it to another place in the prairies and sequester it. That project is like, as a starting point, has a price tag of $16.5 billion. Nothing at that scale has ever worked when it comes to carbon capture. So it's very unlikely that they will capture nearly as much carbon as they think they're going to. So it's a mistake for us to trust that this will work as a way to somehow clean up the oil patch in Canada. It's a money pit because $16.5 billion as a starting place, I think, is very conservative. I think between now and whenever this thing may get built, if they're foolish enough to try to build it, will certainly grow in cost because it's the first of its kind in the world. They're going to be running into a lot of cost overruns there. So it's a money pit for the companies, and they know that. So what they've worked very hard on is trying to convince federal and provincial governments to pay to clean up their mess. So that's the huge risk to Canadians right now, is that already this federal government has put up 60% of the cost of this $16.5 billion project. They've committed through an investment tax credit to pay for 60% of it, and more if the cost balloons. And the oil and gas industry continues to ask for more money, more handouts, more subsidies to make the cost of this project even lower for them and for their profits and for their balance sheet. And aside from all of that, even if this works perfectly, even if it captures 90% or 100% of the carbon, which it certainly will not do, even if for some reason it becomes a lot cheaper, which it certainly won't, um, it only addresses a tiny fraction of the problem. And the problem is that we are pulling hydrocarbons out of the ground, sending them to other places in the world, and burning them. And the solution that this tries to address is only the emissions that come from pulling it out of the ground, which itself is a very dirty process here in Canada when it comes to the oil sands. It only addresses that one tiny fraction of the emissions. It does nothing when we transport it to another part of the world, and where we're transporting it to then burns that fossil fuel and that goes up into the atmosphere too. That still happens completely the same way that it always has. So we're locking ourselves into an oil and gas economy that is dwindling, and we are only increasing our kind of responsibility when it comes to the carbon emissions that are causing this crisis. That folks here in Canada are it's already costing us billions of dollars. It's costing Canadians their lives and their homes and their livelihoods. And we're only making that problem worse, even if the CCUS kind of pipe dream happens perfectly. So I think there are a million reasons to think that this is a mistake. I think the federal government shouldn't put a dime into this kind of project. And I think if they were serious about climate change, if they were serious about giving great economic opportunities to people in Alberta and in the rest of Canada, then we wouldn't waste money on a project like this, and we would instead put it towards something like upgrading our grid, building out renewables, building out efficiency, or many of the other projects that simply just aren't fossil fuels or aren't even in the energy sector here in Canada.
Moving back to the question of ownership, I remember back in November, there was a brief from the Fraser Institute, which is not an outlet I usually cite on the podcast, but they were critical of the Major Projects Office for basically exaggerating its successes. And one thing they pointed out was that the carbon capture system actually doesn't really require regulatory approval because it's largely just a thing a private company puts on its own private operations. And I thought that's actually interesting because what you were talking about when you advocate for the transformation of the grid is really a big change in public infrastructure. What the carbon capture system is, I mean, they work at different levels, but what the carbon capture system, as far as I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to be an appendage on private infrastructure, subsidized publicly.
Exactly.
That it doesn't do anything to actually change the question of power and control in the economy, right? And I think it's similar when they talk about indigenous owned pipelines. Indigenous people in those communities don't actually have much control over the operations of those pipelines. They don't really see any benefits either. It doesn't actually, as far as I understand, do anything to directly reduce their energy costs. It's not feeding into those communities. It's really a question of, I think what you're talking about is also social infrastructure or private subsidies for private companies.
I think there's two things there. I think you're really right on the CCUS piece when it comes to like this is something that is like the risk and the cost is completely on the public dollar, on our tax dollars, but the benefits is all in the hands of private companies. I think that's exactly the kind of thing that we need to avoid, and another reason why this is a mistake. But I'd say um, I'd say that's still a risk in the electricity sector. I think I'm talking about a vision of public, community, and Indigenous ownership of renewables and of the grid in Canada. But that's by no means the only vision out there, or even the most likely outcome. I think we really need to push for a vision of our electricity future, our energy future in Canada that really prioritizes these things like public ownership of the grid, like Indigenous leadership and Indigenous ownership, and making sure that the benefits of these projects flow to communities and not just to private corporations. I'd say that's still an active battle. That's still an active kind of conversation out there in Canada right now. So I hope, and we're going to work damn hard to make that a reality. But I'd say there's a lot of work to do there. But the thing that's exciting for me is that there's every opportunity for that to be the case when it comes to renewables and efficiency and the grid. Whereas big, bulky infrastructure like the oil and gas sector, there's just really no such thing as you were saying too, as like a community-owned mega oil sands project. Um, but on your second piece there, when it comes to Indigenous ownership, I want to be really careful because I'm a settler myself, and I'm not in a position to tell Indigenous communities what's best for them. I think we really need to, that's part of what energy sovereignty means. That's part of what free, prior, and informed consent and really having these nations exert sovereignty over their territories to make their own choices. I think investing in the oil and gas industry is a bad choice, but of course they're free to make that choice. So I think I want to be careful there too. And it's also the case that when there are some pipelines being built, or when there are, maybe an oil well or just any part of fossil fuel infrastructure, I think a lot of the ownership stakes or impact benefit agreements that are signed with Indigenous nations, that's real money and that's real benefit to those communities who've been shut out from the energy industry or shut out from prosperity, from resources on their territory for literally centuries. And they're finally getting a piece of that pie. And I think like that's just a different conversation for me altogether. I think there's more opportunity, and it's a really exciting one to make sure that Indigenous communities have a real opportunity to benefit from this new energy economy, this world of renewables and electricity. Um, but I really can't blame folks for finally, getting some of the benefits of resources on their territory, no matter what those resources are. I think part of my work is just making sure that that moving forward in Canada, we do everything we can to make sure that's not fossil fuels and that's renewables instead.
On the permanent infrastructure question, what is the existing system of community control and what kind of changes would you suggest to it to ensure a kind of transition that's both clean and just, as you were discussing a moment ago?
I think it varies very widely in Canada, and that's like such a common answer when it comes to electricity, is it's done so differently across the 10 provinces and in the territories and in remote communities. It's just so different depending on where you live in Canada. Um, but I'd say in many places, like you can, like in fully privatized electricity systems like Nova Scotia or a private and market-based like Alberta, there's very little kind of community control or public control. You have regulators that set rules, and provincial governments, which are voted in, can set the rules for those regulators, but it's all very indirect. There's a little bit more of a direct mechanism of control or mechanism of like community input or public input on publicly owned utilities in Canada. So BC, some of it's still in Ontario, certainly Quebec, Manitoba, and others are examples of publicly owned utilities, publicly owned electricity companies who are part of the provincial government. So they too are kind of much closer to at least the will of the people insofar as like what they vote for when they vote for their provincial government. But that can cut both ways. We have examples of provinces really cleaning up their act, or provinces with recent examples of really good renewable electricity and Indigenous ownership kind of examples. In British Columbia, they've just gone through a few procurements where they're procuring hundreds of megawatts of new wind. And I think all of the projects except for one were more than 51% owned by Indigenous communities out there in BC. So that's like a good example, and I think has something to do with that kind of public input and public ownership. But the way it cuts the other way is in the example of Saskatchewan, where they also have a provincial crown corporation as their electric utility called Sask Power. And this Saskatchewan government and Sask Power are going completely out the other way. Like they are playing chicken with federal regulations. they're flat out saying that they're not going to listen to the law when it comes to Canada's coal regulations, coal-fired electricity regulations, or the clean electricity regulations. And they're just mandating that that utility reinvest to burn coal into 2050 and beyond. So so that sucks too. And it's not a kind of one size fits all thing that public ownership always leads to a cleaner grid. Um, but I'd say moving forward, like what would make this easier or better? I think public ownership is a huge part of this. So public federal ownership of parts, at least, of these electricity lines that are being built between provinces, I think can be a very good thing. And I think it's an entirely other conversation when you talk about community control, about what opportunities there are for community and Indigenous ownership. And that too varies very widely across Canada. There used to be more common, like community ownership programs, like the ComFit Community Feed-in Tariff in Nova Scotia. There were similar things in New Brunswick, Ontario. And for the most part, these are atrophying. For the most part, it seems that Canada is moving away from dedicated streams of community ownership. And I think that's a shame because I think as we build out a lot of renewables in Canada, we need to make sure that people see the benefits directly, that they themselves maybe own a piece of the wind farm that's going up over the hill, or their neighbor does, or they know someone who has a stake in it. I think that matters so much when it comes to the ownership, the like using the word ownership too much, but like the ownership people feel in it, the connection people feel to this transition. They need to see that they're benefiting not only in lower energy bills, but in having a stake in this, a literal stake in these projects. So I think we really need to see that change in Canada, that there's more opportunities for that. We talked a lot already about Indigenous ownership. I think Indigenous communities are doing a fantastic job of making that case for that priority for provincial procurements of wind and solar, but we need to see that continue because that too is a key way that Indigenous communities can see the benefits of how like resources are being used on their territories. So having projects that are more than 50% owned by the Indigenous nation on whose territory these projects are going up is a really important kind of principle that I think we should carry forward as we build out this huge amount of electricity in the future.
That makes sense. And I think that's also really relevant when I think about like the history of like we mentioned hydro and publicly owned hydro. There is a pretty ugly history of like
Completely,
colonialism that's bound up with
completely.
that, particularly with Hydro Quebec. And you can't control what you don't own. The spirit of public ownership does allow for a degree of control, but it's only allows for it.
Yeah.
It's yeah. If people want to find out more about the project, where should they go?
So for the David Suzuki Foundation, our website is the best place to find. We have open actions where you can let your MP and let your policymakers in your area know that you want to see something like a clean, connected, community-led electricity system. And it has lots of information about all of the kind of campaigns I was talking about here too. So davidsuzuki.org, or if you simply just Google or search online David Suzuki Clean Electricity, that'll all come up, and we'll have lots of links there for connecting with all of our coalition partners too as we do this work through the rest of 2026.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Class and Climate, Perspectives on a Green Economy is produced by myself and Clement Nokos, with editing from Jack McClellan. Class and Climate is a joint project of the Broadbent Institute and the Green Economy Network. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or leave a review on the Perspectives Journal podcast on all major podcast platforms, and share it with someone you know. And subscribe to Press Progress's award-winning Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca. And get more from the Broadbent Institute by subscribing to our mailing list at broadbentinstitute.ca/subscribe.